My son-in-law punched me. There. I said it plainly, like one lays down a bowl of soup on the table, solid, unavoidable, and hot enough to sting. He swung with the kind of calculation I had once thought reserved for men in novels and wars, not for the man who'd come to our house 3 holidays ago with a smile polished by lawyerly lessons. He hit the left side of my face just beneath the cheekbone. The bruise blossomed there like a dark, ugly flower. My pearls, my old pearls that had been my mother's, scattered across the marble hall like small, white confessions. I had gone to my daughter's house that afternoon because it was April 3rd, 2 days before the charity gala she'd overseen for years. It was 6 o'clock when I pressed my hand to the brass and told myself not to ring. The light in the foyer told me they were home. I brought my chipped mug because I cannot drink from anything else. It's a comfort, with a thin hairline crack that remembers every cappuccino my hands have known. I brought a mason jar, a literal jar of coins I have saved for 30 years for no particular thing, only because saving was the habit I inherited with my name. I brought a letter I had meant to tuck into the pocket of a coat that no longer fits. An old note from my husband about a promise they kept. And that note had been folded so often it knew every crease of my life. They opened the door, not with the warmth of a daughter, but with the precision of a secretary. Polite, efficient, and an economy of affection I had not understood until that evening. "Mama," Vivian said, very bright and very distant, as if she were reading from a card at a wedding. Robert, my son-in-law, stood behind her like a shadow standing too close. He smiled with too much white showing, like a man who practices his expressions in glass. "You shouldn't come tonight," Robert said before Vivian had the chance to. His voice carried no heat, only the authority of someone who thinks the universe pivots around his schedule. "You called?" I said. "You left a message about, 'We thought it best,'" Vivian cut in. "It's a busy week." She used our old phrase, the house shorthand for urgency that once meant your chair by the stove is always waiting. They shut the door on me once, then again. Vivian's hand on the knob was the last place I expected to see cruelty. It felt like snow in July. I stood on the doormat and realized, with the strange lucidity of people who have been living in their own memories for too long, that I had been made into yesterday's photograph. They had dressed the postcard of me into the trash can. I told myself that something else explained it, that there had been a misunderstanding. Mothers forgive. It is what we do. So I picked the pearls off the marble as if gathering stray eggs, popped them back into their velvet box, and followed them like a bad scent through the hallway, the house smelling of lemon cleaner and a faraway perfume I could never afford. Portraits on the wall looked down at me the way strangers look at a newspaper article. The family frame that once held pictures of my wedding, my hands clasping Vivian's as she took her first step, had been replaced by an oil portrait of Vivian and Robert smiling like a ticket advertisement for happiness. In the kitchen, they kept talking about numbers, budgets, donors, a legacy gift, language seasoned now with accountants and financial consultants. They said words like fiduciary and estate and trust like incantations. They said, "Over 3 million," with such casualness, I could have been speaking of the price of a dress. Over 3 million for the foundation Vivian had built with her name. Over 3 million that would be distributed to causes that would carry her brand. Over 3 million that had no place for me, who had kept the houseplants alive when Vivian left for New York at 22. Who had ironed her shirts and baked the sponge cakes they photographed for the gala programs. Do not imagine that I was blind to class difference. I had always seen the velvet and the marble and the quiet, efficient hands of people who learn early that money smooths everything. But I had believed, perhaps foolishly, that blood is the stubborn thing that resists bank ledgers. I remember the mason jar on my dresser at home, 6 jars stacked like short, patient soldiers of my saving. It held 2,247 the last time I counted, every coin a small story, a quarter from a favored bus route, a dime saved from a neighbor's birthday plate. I had expected Vivian to smile at the jar and call me silly, and put it in the pantry with a kiss on the forehead. Instead, She told me there was a meeting the following week and that she couldn't have me be a distraction. Be a distraction, she said to me, her own daughter. I nearly laughed. It felt obscene, like a slap wrapped in velvet. Be a distraction. The phrase would cling to me for nights, for it explained everything that followed. They offered alternatives: a short-term assisted living arrangement to ease the transition, a driver for appointments, a social worker who would coordinate care. Each suggestion was a brand, a pamphlet printed in tasteful fonts. Each suggestion cut my home from me like a surgeon with a steady hand. They were already drafting the future of me the way one drafts a house plan, measured, efficient, and without consideration for the heart. I have hands that still know how to knead dough and sew a rip. I have eyes that recall the map of my daughter's face as she sleeps, the slope of her cheek, the dimple that used to catch a frosting. To be told my presence was a problem was to be told my history had become an inconvenience. I left that night with the pearls in my pocket, the mason jar in my bag, and a bruise forming under my skin like a rumor. When I returned home at 8:30, my phone buzzed with a message. We had to call someone to assist for the evening. Don't worry. Signed, Vivian. My son-in-law punched me. My daughter dragged me out by my hair. Over $3 million? Then 911 was called. I repeat the chain because words suture memory. The first punch landed and my world tilted. But what followed was worse because it proved intent. The punch was not an accident of temper, but part of a plan to teach me my place. He struck me, and then, when I crumpled, Vivian grabbed my elbow with a hand I had once smoothed with talcum and dragged me through the foyer by my hair like a sheep being pulled to the slaughter. Her nails caught the scalp near my ear, and I saw stars like small lamps, the ceiling repeating itself as if one had turned a hand mirror repeatedly. We passed the portrait frames. They watched, faceless. The chandelier threw light over us like indifferent witnesses. I will not dwell on the humiliation because you can imagine it. The slick thrum of toes on marble, the scraping of my skirt, the smell of her perfume and lemon oil, the way the door handle felt like the mouth of a beast. I called out for a neighbor once, a woman named Mrs. Ortega, who has always been kind to me, but the house was an island. I tried to reach for the mason jar with my free hand, to have something, anything, that tethered me to the fact I was still a person. They would not let me. Someone, a neighbor maybe, or perhaps the shock made someone press an emergency call, dialed 911. But the number itself did nothing but hiss. I was already inside a machine built for silencing. The operator's voice came through like a distant radio, calm, procedural. Ma'am, stay on the line. I stayed on the line and nothing changed until the ambulance lights appeared like a tear in fog out the driveway. That night lodged itself under my fingernails. The ambulance men looked at me with a cardboard sympathy that felt worse than the blow. At the ER, they asked if I'd fallen. There is a clinical vocabulary for elder injuries, as if the body betrays age alone. No, I was assaulted, I said, and watched a slow color of denial spread over the nurse's face. By my son-in-law, I added, because the world must be named before it can be judged. I left with a certificate in my hand from the hospital, stamped with April 3rd at 21:12, a small legal proof of pain. The doctor suggested I press charges. The social worker suggested mediation. A police officer, young with inkless hands, took a statement that I delivered like a prayer. I have lived long enough to know forms can become fences, and I filled the boxes with trembling fingers. I did not know then the long geometry of the trap I would step into. The first nights after, the television glow was a distant ocean, and I sat with my chipped mug between my hands like a relic. Neighbors stopped, peering into my doorway, speaking in soft voices that measured pity the way some people count coins. My son-in-law's name, Robert, was whispered with the same tone used for car accidents. My daughter's name, Vivian, was given a different tilt, a softer veil, as if she were a woman who misstepped rather than a woman who tore. I sought legal advice the way one seeks a priest, in secret and with dread. A woman at the legal clinic looked at my hospital papers and said the words that begin many dramas. You should consider a durable power of attorney, perhaps a restraining order. She printed a brochure for me. It had a photo of a hand clasping another hand and the words, "Protect your rights." I left with the brochure folded tight in my pocket. Do you know what hurt most? Not the fist. Not even the tug on my hair, as savage as that was. It was the way my daughter's eyes had slid away from mine. The way our history had been exchanged at a ledger. The way they spoke of legacy, that curious modern synonym for a life's meaning, without my presence in the balance. I spent the next weeks patching a life that had been rent like fabric. I thought of the pearls in my pocket, the mason jar in my bag, the letter with my husband's handwriting that had asked her to promise he'd be taken care of. I thought of all the ordinary things that say home, the chipped mug whose rim fits my mouth like a memory, the screen door that always squeaked when wind came from the garden. They had given these things meanings and then, with small, efficient hands, had reallocated those meanings among accountants and grant proposals. I called Vivian once after the hospital. I left a message. Please come and sit. We can talk. Her reply was a text. I'm at a donor meeting tonight. We'll call your care coordinator. There was a line break in her sentence that I have circled around in my mind because it was where our friendship was cleaved. Donor meeting. Care coordinator. The words had replaced greetings. I realized then that names had been removed from our conversations and replaced with roles. I was not Viv's mother now. I was a role to be managed. Perhaps you expect me to tell you I fought back then and there, that I stormed into Vivian's life to strike down the injustice. But age teaches patience the hard way, through the erosion of choice. I could have screamed. I could have shouted. Instead, I learned the usefulness of listening. I listened for whispers in kitchens, for the sound of paper moving in offices, for the slight hesitate when a lawyer said, "It's complicated." I listened. Because if Dumas taught anything to an old woman like me, it is that the most dangerous weapon is patience allied with knowledge. I began to watch their routines. Vivian walked with a new gait, the steady pace of a person used to a calendar's gravity. Robert spent his afternoons on the phone. They spoke of estate planning and consolidating accounts. And the word that stabbed me the worst, conservatorship. I had heard that term. Once before in a televised legal drama. It means control over a person's finances when one is deemed unable to manage them. It is, in practice, the legal pistol that men like Robert use to point at old women like me. I found small anomalies and kept them like pebbles in my pocket. A canceled check with my name that I had never seen. A letter addressed to the estate of Harold Morton, Harold being my husband who had died 8 years prior, dated March 12th. An acceptance of a proposed execution of trust. Why would anyone be moving those papers months ahead? I wrote the date down, March 12th, then April 3rd, the night of the punch. The calendar began to look like a scaffold. I also discovered that Vivian had opened a trust in her name with an initial endowment of about $230,000 that she explained publicly as seed money for her nonprofit's educational wing. The public press release, posted March 28th, spoke of philanthropic transition and building capacity. The language was fine. The timing was not. I placed those dates beside each other like bones to see whether they might suggest a skeleton. I am not a woman who courts pity. I have always preferred the steady labor of dignity. Yet, what does dignity do when you are told to move into a home better suited for your needs and your signature has already been taken? I remembered the soft, persuasive voice of a notary who had once come to my bedside years earlier, when Vivian had asked me to sign a non-disclosure form for a family matter. I asked around. The notary's name was the same. Small circles began to close around me like the rings of a tree trunk. Do you know the strangest thing about betrayal? It is at once petty in the detail and enormous in consequence. One cup of tea can become an explanation for a will. One missed birthday can become an argument for a guardian. So I started gathering like a woman preparing for winter. I took notes. I saved every envelope. I watched bank statements with the vigilance of a hawk. I left my mason jar on the dresser and filled it twice, 3 times until it felt heavy with the weight of insistence. The pearls rested in their velvet box. I tucked the letter from my husband under my mattress for safekeeping. I began to plan the only way I knew how, quietly. I could feel then the shape of the plot that would swallow me if left unchecked. It widened around my family like a flood, and I watched my daughter step into it, erect and true as a captain at the helm, unaware perhaps of the rocks under the surface. I had raised her to be strong, and she was. It is simply that strength can become a blade when guided by a new hand. I found myself at the edges of civility and old affection, and realized how brittle both were. Men in suits have forgotten the language of lullabies. Women in charity dinners have learned to trade in applause. And where did the old heart fall in that bargain? Into a pocket marked honorarium. I will tell you straight, shocks do not come singly. They come in chains, and each link is forged by small decisions. That first night, April 3rd, was only the first link. The bruise would heal in 20 days. The larger bruise, the one that was being mapped in ink and paper, would not. I lay awake the night after visiting them and listened to my own breathing. The moonlight came through my curtains and painted an honest stripe across my floor. I thought of Dumas' great men and their slow, exquisite revenge, and I thought, I am not a man. I am a woman whose hands know the craft of small kindnesses. Yet revenge is not only the province of swords. It is the province of truth kept and revealed. I would keep truth like a ledger, and when the time was right, I would add it up and present it to judgment. A small thing happened then that I filed away, because when one is watching for traps, one files. An old lawyer friend, Mr. Palmer, called me on April 10th at 10:17 a.m., ostensibly to ask how I was. You know, he said, it might be wise to have your durable power of attorney in order. His voice had the tone of a man offering an umbrella on a day when future storms were certain. I smiled and said words that were true and false at once. I think I'll handle it myself. But I made a note of the time and the prompt. 2 days later, I wrote the date April 12th at the top of my pad and under it the words, Watch Watchers. I tell you these things not for melodrama, but because those weeks formed the bedrock of what would come. Each small observation, a canceled check, a press release, a notary's name, was a pebble that would set off an avalanche if arranged just so. You must understand the ordinary in order to appreciate the extraordinary. That is the Dumas truth. The smallest seed can grow into a tree that will shade or smother. I remember standing by my window on April 14th at 3 p.m., the light flat and hard, and thinking that perhaps I had called more ghosts than allies. My hands were steady as if they had carved marble. From the street below came the faint percussion of a neighbor's radio and the scent of jasmine from a garden that knows nothing of lawsuits. I turned the chipped mug in my hands until my thumb found the tiny raised seam where the glaze had once been nicked. It was a small thing, that seam. It felt like a promise. I never expected what I found in that drawer. The moral is simple, and it tastes of iron. When family becomes a ledger, remember that ledgers can be audited. I opened the drawer because I had to know whether the house itself had turned against me. I had been careful to keep the small things that tethered me to my life. The mason jar, the pearls, the chipped mug, but drawers are beehives of habit, places where people hide little truths they are not ready to confess. The envelope was plain, cream, the kind one uses for bills and quiet letters. My name was written on it in Vivian's handwriting, flourished, neat, the kind that adorns invitations and donor plaques. But the paper inside made my throat close like a door. It was a copy of a document titled Durable Power of Attorney. The effective date read, March 12, 2025. The notary block bore the stamp and signature of a notary I had seen once before in a hospital room, the same woman who'd come with a clipboard when Vivian had wanted me to sign away a small family matter for convenience. There were initials in places I had never initialed, a full signature that resembled mine but did not. The line where the principal was supposed to sign, the line that should have held my trembling hand, bore a script that looked like my name, but the strokes were too confident. the loops too young for the slow, careful hand I now possessed. My first thought was that perhaps I had signed and forgotten, an old woman's failing memory performing once more. My second thought, quicker and more terrible, was that my signature had been taken without me, that a quiet theft had been carried out in the name of efficiency. I remember the exact time, April 18th, 2025, 11:42 a.m. I still have that minute recorded in my bones like a tolling bell. I sat down on the edge of my bed with the document in my hands and felt the room tilt. The mason jar sat on the dresser, sunlight turning the coins into a tiny, stubborn constellation. I thought of the notary's earlier visit, of the way Vivian's voice had been sweet and convincing, like someone rehearsing an aria. And then I remembered the small things that had been wrong for weeks. A canceled check in my name I did not write, a bank statement whose totals made me dizzy, a press release from March 28th about a $230,000 donation to Vivian Morton Foundation that had been described as seed money for school scholarships. My thumb found the chipped rim of my cup as if it were a compass, and I breathed. You must understand that when you have lived as long as I have, you become good at distinguishing the texture of truth from the texture of a lie. This did not feel like a mistake. This felt planned. I brought the document to Mr. Palmer that afternoon. You have to meet him if you have not. Harold Palmer, SQer, retired and irascible in the way that legal men tend to be when they still carry a small flame of indignation. He met me at his office on April 20th at precisely 3 p.m., because lawyers have clocks in their heads that tick with deadlines. He put on his glasses, peered at the durable power of attorney, and his face went from courteous to small-town constable. "This is not your signature," he said, slowly, like a man pronouncing an ancient name, "and the notary journal should contain an entry showing the date, the time, the type of identification presented." He tapped his pen on the paper. "If you didn't sign this, then someone has forged your name and had it notarized. That is a felony." I felt a cold relief at the word felony because it made my experience into something the law recognized as wrong. "Can we get the journal?" I asked. "Can we get the bank tapes? The CCTV?" Mr. Palmer's answer was practical and immediate. "Yes, we will get the notary journal. We will file for a subpoena to the bank for CCTV. But be prepared. Your daughter will have responses ready. They are not careless people." I nodded like a woman who had been listening to a long sermon and found a line to sing. We made a plan. First, get the notary journal and file a request for all documents related to any account changes or gifts from Harold Morton Estate. Second, approach the bank compliance officer discreetly. Third, see if anyone at the law firm had a conscience left in them. We began by visiting the notary. Her name was Mrs. DeLuca, and she lived not far from me, a woman of 65 who sold pastries on weekends and liked to cheat at knitting. She opened her door with flour on her apron and looked at my copy of the durable power of attorney like one inspects a pie for cracks. "I remember the day," she said, when Mr. Palmer asked her about March 12th. "I was at home that morning. I signed at 11. But I did not sign this." Her voice creaked under the weight of the fact. She pulled out her notary journal, a heavy ledger kept by law, and we looked for March 12th. There it was, an entry noting a signing at 11:07 a.m. Name written down as H. Morton, notarized by her stamp. But the identification listed was not mine. It was a photocopy of an ID bearing my name, but with a photograph of a woman I did not know. I will never forget how the ledger looked. Handwriting, where the ink had sunk into the page. The number of the ID, the type of document, the initials of the signer. The notary's entry was a brittle thing, and in it lay the first sliver of the conspiracy, an ID photocopy that had been made to look like mine. Mrs. DeLuca's hand shook as she signed an affidavit to that effect. We needed more. Mr. Palmer wrote a subpoena to the bank on April 22nd requesting any CCTV footage around March 12th and copies of all transactions involving my name between February and April. They replied that they would comply under subpoena, but compliance, we would learn, is a cage with invisible bars. While the legal wheels creaked, I continued to listen in the manner of a woman who has been ignored, not with a fury that flashes and fades, but with a patience that eats away at stone. I spent time in the small cafes where donors went to be seen and listened to the staff after service when they unbuttoned their collars. I would go to the library and watch the lawyers who file papers at the courthouse and note the names on their briefcases. In the garden, I would sit and pretend to read. And sometimes a gardener would come and gossip idly about parties and arrangements. A young woman named Maya, who worked in the foundation as a paralegal and who once had the decency to smile at me genuinely, became an unexpected ally. I had seen her at the gala in earlier years, bringing glasses and clearing plates, with a deference that suggested she had always been taught to smooth ruffles. Once she noticed me at a bench near the foundation office and sat with me. "You look like you could use a cup of tea and a friend," she said, and I told her about the document and watched her face blanch. "I can help," she said. "There are things they hide in plain sight. The foundation keeps its donor records in a cloud server, but they print summaries that get filed. I could copy some files, if you want to bring me a stamped envelope with a return address." We did not trade in grand conspiracies. Maya traded me fear for ink. She brought me a USB drive one night, and we sat in my kitchen at 9:30 p.m. on April 26th and watched numbers crawl across the screen. Transfers, internal memos, a line item labeled Seed Grant for $230,000, dated March 28th. Another line showed a transfer of $50,000 on April 1st, described as consulting fees to an account at a shell company bearing Robert's initials. The numbers were a map that led us out of the house and into offices and safety deposit boxes. I felt the rise of something in my chest then, a heat like the first wind of an approaching storm. The moral of patience, which I had been rehearsing like a hymn, began to shift into strategy. One must sometimes move from listener to actor when the stakes are theirs to lose. Dumas once said, "In the way that great men say small truths loudly, that revenge is a dish best served with evidence." I kept that sentiment as a pocket-sized weapon. 2 days later, on April 28th at 10:25 a.m., Maya handed me a photocopy she had taken from a file in the foundation's office. It was an internal memo from the firm handling our family matters, Morton and Blake, dated March 3rd, 2025, addressed to Vivian and Robert, discussing securing transfer of assets through durable power of attorney and subsequent conservatorship if necessary. The memo was clinical, the language of men who dehumanize with nouns. It spoke of minimizing disruption to donor relations. It also recommended having a 24/7 care protocol in case of behavioral incidents. That phrase, behavioral incidents, stung because it sounded like instructions to manufacture a reason. I kept the photocopy folded in my bra like contraband and listened to my heartbeat, as if it were a metronome for a plot. The more we learned, the more the web tidied itself. An entry at the bank showed that safety deposit box 422 had been accessed on April 15, 2025. At 10:05 a.m., the signature on the ledger showing R. Morton, authorized agent, and a receipt noting the removal of bagged documents. The receipt was innocuous. The bag was not. Maya's fingers, which had once smoothed paper for donors, trembled when she said, "They emptied a box." I will tell you now what I decided to do. And I say it in no small voice because there is gravity in the choice. I would not wait for a legal spiderweb to trap me in its center. I would go to the bank myself. On May 1st at 9 a.m., I dressed in my best coat, a navy thing with a fraying cuff, and I took a taxi to First National. I had an appointment arranged by Mr. Palmer, who had subpoenaed the bank for copies of any access records for safety deposit box 422. We entered the bank with the quiet confidence of people who have reason on their side. The manager, a man named Mr. Ellsworth, handsome in the way of people whose job is to look like they care, brought out a ledger. I will never forget the way the ledger looked open on the mahogany counter. There, under April 15, 2025, 10:05 a.m., A neat entry noted the opening of Box 422 and a removal of documents, signed by R. Morton with the initials of the attendant. We asked for the attendant's ID. He handed us a badge number and a name, Alonzo Ruiz. Mr. Ellsworth excused himself and came back with a photocopy of the receipt showing the removal. It was a smoking gun in plain paper. How did they get access? I asked, but I already knew the answer. The durable power of attorney, the forged one, had given them the authority. Alonzo, who had been the teller on duty that day, agreed to speak to us in private because he, too, had a conscience stored like a spare key. He told us that the signature on the release form did not match the one on file, that the photograph on the ID did not match the woman he had met years before when she had opened the box, and that he had filed a suspicious activity report on April 16, 2025. He had been told by a supervisor to document it and move on. He had not moved on. He brought out his copy of the CCTV, which, much to our gratitude, had backed up frames stored for 30 days. There, in the footage crammed into a tiny, grainy screen, we saw Vivian and Robert at the counter on April 15th, hands exchanging a bag as Alonzo looked on. They had smiled like people who own the world, and Robert had shown an ID with my name in block letters. I wish I could say that seeing that footage made blood rise in me like a war drum. It made my stomach flip, yes. It made my hands cold, and it made my resolve new. But the documentary truth of tape is a tidy thing. It both reveals and denies the human in it. In the grainy footage, my handwriting looked less like mine and more like a signature anyone could mimic. We now had the notary affidavit, the bank CCTV, the safety deposit box receipt, the foundation internal memo, and bank transfer records, all the instruments of a plot sharpened on calculation. We had a dossier. We went to the district attorney on May 3, 2025 at 2:15 p.m. I sat in the office of Assistant District Attorney Layla Benton, who had eyebrows that told you she had been hired to weigh guilt and did not like to be surprised. I laid the photocopies and the notary affidavit and the CCTV frames out before her. She read with a face that grew taut with attention. "This is prosecutable," she said, simple and blunt. "Forgery, fraud, elder abuse. We need a referral to the civil courts for an emergency injunction, and a criminal investigation will follow." At that moment, the plot split into two lanes. The civil lane for immediate protection of my person and estate, and the criminal lane to catch the men behind the curtain. We filed an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order and emergency conservatorship reversal. We asked the court to freeze accounts linked to the foundation pending an audit. I could feel the turning of the wheel then, the decisive moment that Dumas would call the crossing of a threshold. I would not be an old shadow in their foyer. I would be a plaintiff and an actor, standing in a room designed for judgment and asking it to do its work. The moral brightened in my chest like a candle in a cathedral. Truth gathered like water, and when directed it carved stone, and then they struck back. I expected resistance. I expected legal counters, frantic calls, maybe even a PR campaign to tell the world we were misunderstood. What I did not expect was the speed and the audacity. On May 4th at 9:34 a.m., as Mr. Palmer and I were about to file the emergency motion, I received an envelope from Morton and Blake, the family firm, sealed, stiff, and smelling faintly of cologne. Inside was a document labeled Amendment to Will and Confirmation of Durable Power of Attorney, dated April 2, 2025, and accompanied by a notarization I had not seen before, this one bearing another notary's name, Ingrid Hollis. The amendment gave Vivian full authority over the estate and declared me mentally compromised. The language was clinical and cruel. Attached was a doctor's letter stating a brief evaluation on April 1, 2025, expressing concern about my short-term memory. The doctor's note bore a stamp and signature I did not recognize. It felt then as if they had anticipated my every move, as though they had rehearsed this puppet theater in a room I had not been allowed into. The court clerk told us that the amendment had been submitted as an urgent filing and that Morton and Blake had already requested a hearing scheduled for May 6, 2025 at 9:00 a.m. They had not only stolen documents, they had countered with their own papered world. The game was now in a courthouse where speed matters more than mercy. I will not lie. Fear came like a cold hand. They had produced a doctor's evaluation, another notarized piece, and had submitted emergency papers of their own. I thought of the mason jar in my dresser that morning and felt how small it was against machines of law. Yet the anger I felt was a hotter weapon than fear. I woke at dawn on May 5th and wrote a list under the heading Things That Are True. I wrote in the list the notary journal entry, the bank CCTV, the safety deposit receipt, Mrs. DeLuca's affidavit, Alonzo's suspicious activity report, the internal memo from March 3rd, the transfer log of March 28th showing $230,000. Truth, I decided, is best when arranged like notes in a score. When you play them together, they form a chorus too loud to ignore. Mr. Palmer filed our emergency injunction at 10:02 a.m. on May 5th with supporting documents. The clerk assigned a hearing for May 6th at 9 a.m., the same hour Morton and Blake had scheduled their hearing. The courthouse hummed like a hive as both sides prepared. Press had been tipped, and a columnist from the Tribune called to see whether the Morton family drama would make for Sunday column inches. At noon that day, Maya brought yet another marvel, a voicemail she'd recently found on a work phone, forwarded inadvertently when a tech person was copying files. It was recorded on April 11, 2025 at 7:01 p.m., and the voice on it, Robert's low, practiced timbre, spoke into a phone about making sure the paperwork looks convincing and said, explicitly, if she resists, call 911 and say she's disoriented. We'll have the documentation to back us up. He laughed in the recording, a small, cruel sound. Maya had saved the file and handed it to me as if it were a spark. I listened to Robert's voice in my kitchen that afternoon and felt something like iron settle into my spine. He had not only planned the theft, he had planned the performance that would make the law nod and turn away. The recording was damning, and in our jurisdiction, admissible as evidence because it was found on a company device and forwarded, though defense lawyers would contest its context. This piece, Robert's recorded intent, was the hinge upon which the rest of our case swung. We made copies and brought them to Ada Benton, who put them into evidence and promised she would present them at the hearing. The district attorney now had motive and method in her file, and motivated men are useful allies. The night before the hearing, I paced my kitchen until my feet ached. I thought of the small things again. Pearls, mason jar, a chipped mug. I thought of Vivian as a child, kneeling in flour beside me, fingers powdered, laughing. How love becomes a ledger is a question for philosophers and thieves alike. I picked up my phone at 11:11 p.m., thumbed the number of Mrs. Ortega, and asked her to come over at 7 a.m. She arrived with 2 thermoses of coffee and a face I trusted. My morning was a sequence. Prayer, a cup of coffee in the chipped mug, pearls warmed in my palm. Each ritual steadied me. I dressed simply, but with care, because appearances matter in a courtroom. The law, like theater, responds to costume. At 8:20 a.m. on May 6, 2025, Mr. Palmer, Ada Benton, Mrs. Ortega, Maya Alonzo, and I entered the county courthouse. The clock over the hall said 8:33 a.m. The air smelled of old leather and lemon polish. Cameras were already set up. A reporter tried to ask me a question, but Mr. Palmer moved us into a small conference room reserved for counsel. He whispered, "We will present the notary journal, the CCTV stills, the bank receipt, the transfer records showing $230,000, the internal memo from March 3rd, Alonzo's affidavit, Mrs. DeLuca's affidavit, and the voicemail from Robert. That should be enough for a temporary restraining order to freeze assets and block the conservatorship for now." I could feel the hinge swinging. I had chosen to fight, and the door was moving. The courtroom was packed by 9 a.m. The bailiff called the case, Morton vs. Morton conservatorship. Morton and Blake's counsel, Ms. Lang, stood with a pile of papers and the blank, composed face of a woman who had argued against lesser things. Vivian entered with an expression I could no longer name. She looked at me for a heartbeat and then away. Robert sat like a man who has always believed the world owed him its stage. Mr. Palmer rose and spoke with the simple eloquence of a man who believes in rightness. He laid out our proofs one by one. He walked the judge, the Honorable Judge Ferris, through the notary journal entry and Mrs. DeLuca's affidavit, showed the CCTV stills of Vivian and Robert at the bank and the receipt for Box 422, and played the voicemail where Robert coldly explained the plan. He showed the transfer on March 28th of $230,000 into the foundation's account. He asked the court for a temporary restraining order to freeze the accounts and to halt any conservatorship proceedings until full discovery could be had. Then the defense rose. Ms. Lang smiled like someone offering a glass of water. She produced a bundle of papers, new affidavits, a doctor's assessment of my memory from April 1st, a notarized amendment to the will dated April 2nd, and an emergency filing asserting that I had expressed confusion and memory lapses to multiple caregivers. At one point, she waved a sheet and said with a lawyer's practiced pity, "This is for her own protection." Judge Ferris listened with the neutrality of a man used to weighing storms. He asked pointed questions about the chain of custody for the voicemail, about the bank's practices, about the notary's journal. When he turned to look at me, his gaze was not unkind, but it held the gravity of someone who knew that decisions like this leave scars. We presented our case. They presented theirs. The room buzzed like a beehive with the close murmur of things being fought over. I felt like something ancient walking into a court where paper had more memory than people. Then, in the middle of the hearing, at precisely 10:47 a.m., the bailiff entered with an envelope. It was addressed in a handwriting that looked suspiciously like Vivian's. He handed it to the clerk, who looked at Judge Ferris and read aloud a short, crisp statement. Emergency filing by Morton and Blake. Alleged threat to donor confidence. Request for immediate custodial arrangement for institutional care pending full psychiatric evaluation. The statement was accompanied by a concise video clip, grainy and edited, showing me in my kitchen on April 30th, holding the mason jar and speaking to a neighbor in a manner someone could cut and present as agitated. Mr. Palmer stood up, face like thunder. "Your Honor," he said, "that video has been edited and lacks context. We have affidavits that show the mishandling," Ms. Lang countered. "We are simply ensuring the well-being of a vulnerable adult whose behavior has been inconsistent. It was a toggle between two worlds, one that seeks to protect and one that seeks to possess." I felt my pulse in my temple as if someone had placed a small drum there and asked it to keep time. The judge, who had the weary patience of a man taught to measure lives, sat back and said quietly, "We will take this under advisement and reconvene at 1:30 p.m. Meanwhile, I will issue a short order, no disbursements from the foundation account until further notice." Relief flared briefly like a match, and then the room shifted. A murmured conversation at the back rose, and a young officer leaned forward and whispered something to the clerk. The bailiff cleared his throat and stepped to the side. My chest tightened. At 12:58 p.m., as we were leaving the courthouse vestibule to have a quick lunch and prepare for the afternoon reconvening, Mrs. Ortega's hand found mine and squeezed it like a prayer. "They will not take you," she said. I wanted to believe her. We were halfway down the granite steps when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I let it ring. The sound was sharp as a bell. Then it connected, and a voice I recognized, the voice I had once heard at my door in the foyer, came through. It was the operator on a telephonic line, calm and efficient. 911, what is your emergency?" she asked. My head snapped up. Alonzo's face, who had been beside me, drained of color. Mr. Palmer's eyes met mine and widened. "They have called 911, he said, and the words landed like a stone. I never expected they would call the police to remove me from the very house that had birthed my daughter. I had chosen to fight. They had chosen to call for the gavel of the state. They called the police to take me away at noon, as if a siren could tidy a life or a badge could iron out a betrayal. I remember the exact sound of the officer's boot on Vivian's marble as he stepped into the foyer, a hollow drum beat that matched the one in my temples. They had dressed their performance with the velvet of urgency, a doctor's note, a grainy video, A 911 call that set the machinery of protection in motion against the very person it was meant to shelter. I will tell you what happened next in the plain way I have learned after long years. People rushed in with procedures, and I answered them with patience sharpened into armor. Mr. Palmer and Ada Benton arrived like 2 battalions at the same hour, papers flapping like banners. Maya, oh brave, clever Maya, had brought additional copies of the voicemail and the financial trail. Alonzo, the teller with a moral spine, swore to his suspicious activity report on the courthouse. Affidavit once more. Mrs. Ortega sat on my sofa and held my hand as if the word mother were a talisman. The officers asked me to step outside while they assessed whether I needed to be removed for my safety. I stepped out into sunlight that cut clean across the driveway and felt the sting of 100 people's opinions. A camera from the local news crew pivoted toward me like a small, inquisitive animal. "Ma'am, for your protection, we may need to assist you in moving to a temporary care facility," one of the officers said, gentle and practiced. "Assist me?" I asked, and my voice was the small instrument of someone who has spent a lifetime learning how to speak plainly. "This is my home. I have lived here for 31 years since Harold died. I have paid my taxes. I make my own tea." The mundanity of those statements was my shield. They hesitated because our legal filings had not yet concluded. Ada Benton invoked the temporary restraining order Judge Ferris had issued earlier that morning, which halted disbursements and froze the contested accounts. "Until the court rules further," she said, "no one may remove Ms. Morton from her residence." The police lowered their hands like men disappointed by a clock. I felt a small surge of triumph then. Not the violent sort, but a clean, virtuous relief. The kind that comes when truth aligns with law. The moral is this, and it rings true like a bell in a cathedral. The law is a slow beast, but when fed with facts, it can be a savior. This is a truth Dumas would have nodded at, for he understood that justice, like patience, takes time to sharpen. When truth is armed with evidence, the slowest justice can become the keenest sword. Micro cliffhanger. They filmed my face like evidence. The first week after the courthouse, our campaign of small triumphs began to roll forward with the inertia of a well-oiled machine. We had the notary's affidavit, the CCTV stills, Alonzo's SR, the March 3rd memo from Morton and Blake, and the voicemail in which Robert spoke with surgical cruelty about making paperwork look convincing and calling 911 to manufacture a pretext. We added to this pile a new jewel, the real doctor, Dr. Mehta, who, upon being subpoenaed, produced his own file. Not a short, perfunctory note from April 1st, but a full clinical record. He said, under oath on May 12, 2025 at 10:30 a.m., that he had not evaluated me on April 1st. Had not written the brief evaluation that had been submitted by Morton and Blake, and that the signature appended to that supposed letter did not match his. Forensic document analysis later confirmed his assertion. The doctor's signature on the amendment to the will was a forgery. Once you see forged ink under microscope light, you understand how audacity loves disguise. The forged doctor's note was the desperate, ugly heart of their counterattack. Remove it, and the house of cards tilts. The public began to sense something amiss. A donor who had once spoken of Vivian at galas with a breathless admiration now asked her board for an independent audit. Another major benefactor paused a $500,000 pledge. Word travels like a junior courier, and when donors pull back, empires built on applause find cracks. Micro cliffhanger. The doctor said he never signed that paper. I will not pretend we won everything at once. Litigation is a long river, and we were only beginning to dredge it. Morton and Blake countered with a motion to expedite their conservatorship claim, pressing forward with a different notary, Ingrid Hollis, whose journal, when cross-checked, contained suspicious gaps. Our forensic handwriting analyst, a woman named Claire Wexler, who smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee, and had the patient eyes of someone who has made careers from squinting at loops and tails, testified that the purported signature on my durable power of attorney did not match known exemplars of my handwriting submitted from my checks. She pointed to the way the letters joined, the pressure points, and the nervous little uplift on my T that always betrayed my hand. The differences were small only to the untrained eye. Claire's testimony was precise. The signature on the April 2nd amendment, she told the court, exhibits motor patterns inconsistent with Ms. Morton's historical handwriting. In my professional opinion, it is not a genuine signature. The judge, who has the weary, grave air of someone balancing scales, took notes. The audience shifted in their seats as if a wind had changed direction. Micro cliffhanger. The handwriting expert smiled sadly. Between hearings, our small army did other work. Mrs. DeLuca took us to a storage facility where, through legal channels, we learned of copies of documents deposited in safety deposit boxes and temporary storage during transfers. Alonzo's employer reopened their internal audit and found, to its dismay, that staff had been subtly pressured to expedite releases. Maya continued to work from the inside, quietly copying donor lists and email threads that discussed asset consolidation and minimizing legacy risk. It was in one of these threads that the bright, treacherous light fell upon the firm itself. An email from a partner at Morton & Blake, dated March 10, 2025, and addressed to Vivian, advised language that would minimize the probability of contested wills and suggested a procedural loop by which a durable power of attorney could be executed and notarized for convenience at the next family gathering. The language was cold and the intent obvious. Create a paper trail that would look tidy in court, but which had been designed to conceal rather than to reveal. The courtroom, which had been a stage of words, began to show cracks in the floorboards as the truth leaked in like rain. The press, which had been primed for a scandal of a different sort, now smelled wrongdoing and reported with the veracity of hunters scented to prey. A local columnist wrote, "When charity meets family, the ledger sometimes wins." It stung less because of its cruelty and more because of its accuracy. Micro cliffhanger. The email smelled like betrayal. At this point, I must pause and tell you, in the breathless manner Dumas favored when the morale of a scene must be pressed, that there is a dignity in a life that will not grovel. I was a grandmother, not a warrior by trade, but I had raised a daughter to be certain of herself and what she deserved, and I had a mason jar filled with pennies and patience. The world is often quick to forget the small, cheap things that make a life livable, but those small things mount like an army. There is nobility in preserving memory and name against thieves who traffic in names like coins. The vilest schemers believe paper can replace blood, yet paper must answer to testimony, and testimony is where the soul leaks. Then came the big hearing, the one that would decide whether the conservatorship motion would be granted emergency powers or be rebuffed. May 20th, 2025, at 9 a.m., the county courthouse smelled of lemon polish and new subpoenas. The public gallery was full. This was no longer a private quarrel. It had become an exhibit from which the town could learn, or gloat, Ms. Lang, representing Morton & Blake, and, by extension, Vivian and Robert, called witnesses that painted a portrait of an elderly woman experiencing brief lapses among long stretches of lucidity. They produced testimony from a home health aide who claimed to have seen agitation on 2 occasions, details vague, time-stamped imprecise. They presented the edited video clip that showed me, outside context, appearing distracted and holding the mason jar. They asked the court to consider the welfare of a vulnerable adult. We answered with anchors. The notary, Mrs. DeLuca, who testified that the notary journal entry for March 12th contained an ID photocopy that matched no one she recognized. Alonzo, the teller, who provided the CCTV that showed Vivian and Robert at the bank. Claire Wexler with her handwriting analysis. The forensic digital analyst who traced the voicemail to Robert's company phone and the metadata that showed edits to the April 30th video, splices made to create a narrative of agitation, and, finally, Dr. Mehta, who testified that no evaluation occurred on April 1st. The evidence was a chorus. The turning of fate is often a quiet thing until it is not. In the midst of the hearing, Ms. Lang attempted to introduce a late affidavit from a social worker who attested to my declining memory. Mr. Palmer objected and demanded authentication. The affidavit's letterhead was suspicious. Mr. Palmer, who had the manner of an old captain, asked the clerk to bring the social worker into the courtroom. There, under oath, the social worker confessed she had been instructed by a junior associate at Morton and Blake to sign the document, but had in fact never met me. The associate, when called to testify, stammered and then provided the name of his supervisor who had handed off the instruction. Documents, it seemed, were being mass-produced in an assembly line of convenience rather than care. Micro cliffhanger, one papered lie led to another. When the judge called for closing remarks, Mr. Palmer stood and spoke in that voice of quiet thunder. He did not shout. He did not pander. He laid out every item with the slow care of a baker arranging pastries. Notary journal, bank CCTV, safety deposit receipt, March 3rd internal memo, the March 28th transfer of $230,000, the voicemail in which Robert explained the plan to call 911 to compound the appearance of disorientation, the forged doctor's note, and the social worker who had signed a paper she had not read. Ada Benton, who had been listening like a hawk, rose and delivered a sentence that will remain with me because of its measured, terrible justice. "This case is not merely about money," she said. "It is about the affair of dignity. To strip an elder of autonomy for the sake of an institution's ledger is to commit a theft of the worst kind." The judge, finally, did what the slow beast of law sometimes does. He steadied himself and issued a detailed order. He denied the emergency conservatorship and found probable cause to refer the matter for criminal investigation into alleged forgery, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He issued an immediate order freezing the foundation's accounts beyond the initial temporary, freeze and appointing a neutral receiver to audit. Transfers made in March and April of 12. He also granted me, as the aggrieved party, a temporary protective order against Robert and Vivian to limit contact and a directive to Morton and Blake to produce all communications related to the estate within 7 days. Micro cliffhanger. The judge's gavel fell like a verdict. You must forgive my glee. Call it what you will, relief, vindication, the tiny bloom of righteous warmth. But when the authorities move from "we will consider" to actual action, the world begins to right itself in small, lovely increments. Within days, the DA's office obtained indictments. On May 22, 2025, Robert Morton was arrested and charged with forgery, Penal Code Para 470, elder financial abuse, a charge under Welfare and Institutions Code Para 15610 in our state, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Morton and Blake faced an inquiry by the state bar for unsavory collaboration, an investigation that would later lead to sanctions for several partners. Vivian, whose name had once been spoken with civic pride, was suspended from her role on the foundation board and resigned under pressure from donors who feared contagion of reputation. The public humiliation was surgical. On June 1st, the gala she had planned was canceled. The venue announced refunds, and donors expressed deep concern in a dozen polite statements. A headline in the Tribune read, "Morton Foundation in Turmoil. Board ousts heiress." The phrasing stung because it had been built upon inhuman planning, but there was a satisfaction in the justice of consequence. Micro cliffhanger. The gala never happened. I will describe the day Robert was arraigned because the scene is a lesson in the theater of justice and the vanity of malefactors. He came into the courtroom with his suit cut to a price and a face that had not yet learned to face consequences. He was polite to our counsel in a way that felt like an attempt to bargain for softness. The clerk read the charges: forgery, elder abuse, conspiracy. He entered pleas of not guilty, eyes sliding to Vivian in the gallery. Vivian sat apart, sullen and small in a designer dress. Some people wept quietly. Others clutched their programs like rosaries. The bail was set with an amount meant to match the audacity of the theft: $250,000. I watched, and in that watching something uncoiled inside me. It was not merely the thrill of seeing justice move. It was the reconciling of a life. I had once thought that dignity could be reduced to a ledger entry, But dignity, like a tree, holds roots that do not snap under pruning. Months later, after audits and hearings and depositions, the court ordered restitution. On August 1st, 2025, the judge signed an order requiring the immediate return of $230,000 to the foundation's restricted scholarship account and the recovery of $50,000 paid to the shell company controlled by Robert. The judge further ordered that the estate accounts be re-audited, and any funds improperly taken or transferred would be subject to trustee recovery actions. Morton and Blake was ordered to pay sanctions and reimburse legal costs. In short, the financial orchestra that had been playing a melody of theft was interrupted and the music stopped. Micro cliffhanger. The ledger began to blink red. But the more satisfying justice was not only in paper and court orders, it was in the small public stripping of power. Vivian lost her speaking invitations. The certificates she hung on the wall were removed by hands she could not influence, and the foundation board replaced its leadership with a coalition that prioritized transparency. Donors returned some funds and redirected others into a small fund I insisted be created in Harold Morton's name. A genuine scholarship, administered by trustworthy hands, with an initial seed from the returned funds. I asked that the program be modest, that it support neighborhood children seeking trade education, because my life had been one of small skills and steady labor. I accepted the material reparations because they were necessary. But I also demanded a form of moral restitution I thought more valuable: public acknowledgement. In a modest statement to the press on August 3, 2025 at 11 a.m., the board issued an apology to me for oversights in governance and for the way family dynamics intertwined with institutional decision-making. The language was careful and imperfect, but it was an admission in a world where apologies are rare as spring rain. Vivian offered a teary public apology that I accepted, and then she disappeared from our lives for reasons she would later explain as needing time. My revenge was not vindictive. It was restorative. I did not seek to see walls close around the children of my own house. I sought to see the truth acknowledged and to ensure it would not happen to another neighbor. I asked the court, and it obliged, to institute oversight measures for nonprofits and to encourage banks to tighten procedures around access to safety deposit boxes and outflow. Authorizations, small changes that would make the machinations of a Robert less easy to execute. There were softer, tender counsels too. Maya left the foundation and became a compliance officer for a small nonprofit that specialized in community microgrants. She visited my kitchen on Sundays, and we baked bread together the way we used to bake hope from flour. Alonzo was promoted within his bank for his integrity. He refused to accept a big reward, saying only, "I did what felt like the right thing." Mrs. DeLuca, the notary, posted a photo on social media holding a cup of coffee and a sign that said, "Check your notaries." It went viral for reasons I could not entirely explain. Perhaps people like to see small people stand up. Micro cliffhanger. The neighborhood began to breathe again. As for Vivian and Robert, their fates were not purely punitive. Robert, after a bench trial on multiple counts scheduled for the fall, eventually pled guilty to forgery and elder financial abuse. He received a sentence that included prison time and restitution. The precise days and months of his confinement are a ledger for the state, but his liberty was curtailed and his reputation ruined. Vivian, stripped of board positions and public favor, spent months in counseling and quietly volunteered at a community kitchen as part of her restitution agreement. The world is often kinder to those who seek repair rather than revenge. The pearls, which tumbled from my neck the night of the first assault, are now strung in a small shadow box on my kitchen wall. People ask me if I feel vindicated when they see them. I tell them no, and then I tell them yes. Vindication is a complicated fruit, sweet, but grown from bitterness. The mason jar sits beside them, neatly labeled community seed in my fingers' uneven script. On August 10th, I opened the jar and poured $2,430.47 into the new Harold Morton Neighborhood Trades Fund. It felt like a tiny army stepping out of my dresser. I met with the board and asked them to use that small amount to buy tools and materials for 2 apprenticeships that month. The tradesman who received the grant told me, with astonished gratitude, that a child who had never owned pliers now had tools of his own. That child's hands, the young, eager hands, felt like a benediction, and I understood then that justice is best when it creates good. I will not paint the world as rosy. The scandal cost my family dearly in public capital and private loss. There were days when I still woke to phantom tugs on my hair and flinched at gilded doorways. There were nights when the argument I had with my daughter replayed in my head like a scratched record. Rebuilding dignity is a slow work, as slow as knitting a sweater with a single needle. But my daughter and I, once estranged by ledger and law, met on the steps of truth and began, clumsily and humanly, to talk like people who had shared a lifetime yet needed to relearn one another. Before I close this long tale, which has been for me like untying a knot that had strangled a heart, I must leave you with a final moral, Dumas-esque in its sweep. Those who think to measure a person by her account balance will find themselves measured by history. And history, unlike men with ledgers, tends to remember things with an honest hunger. The petty theft of a name is small in comparison to the theft of dignity. When the latter is returned, it creates a force by which the world may be rearranged. And now, dear listener, a few practical truths for those who might find themselves in the thin, sharp wind of similar betrayal. Keep copies of all documents. Watch bank statements like a hawk. Ask for independent audits when large transfers occur. And never be ashamed to ask for help. Surround yourself with people who will hold your hand. And if you can, find a Maya or an Alonzo or a Mrs. DeLuca among your neighbors. The small, honest people are the ones who will turn the tide. If my story touched you, and I hope it touched you not merely with scorn, but with a small spiritual warmth, then I ask a favor in the old way that women used to ask of one another across fences. Share this with someone who needs courage. If your heart found a beat in this story, click that subscribe button. Comment below with a memory of what steadied you through hard times. Your words could be someone else's map. We live in an age of ledgers indeed, but also of community. Let us use both, and if you ever see someone with a mason jar, do not laugh. Ask what is inside. You might find more than coins. You might find a stubborn, patient heart saving a life.